Welcome everyone to the SMP community meeting. Today is 30th of September. A few folks have not been able to join us today, but we have an agenda today to discuss. So let's get started. First up, we have a call for participation for reviewing the SMP spec and identifying areas to improve in this spec. So Lee, would you like to talk about it a bit?
Yeah, sure. So right. So in the SMP protos themselves, so the crux of the spec, there are currently the spec is broken into 3 protos, if I recall. Now, there's kind of a fork in the road that I think that we face at the moment with respect to kind of how to refine and carry the spec forward. So, particularly inside of the service mesh proto spec itself, we've had people, so yeah, if you go to the third one, Navendu, we've had people, coming through with wanting performance details of their nodes, of their Kubernetes clusters, in context of their service meshes and in context of their workloads, and that's all within scope of the spec, right? It's all of those things build upon one another. Like you can't just analyze the performance of a service mesh in a vacuum, unto its own, unless the rest of the environment is perpetually uniform. And that's a stipulation that we could place on the spec. We could say the spec is only valid, or the measurements are only valid when the environment is uniform for a given set of test results. The problem with that is if Suhani has one type of environment, I have a different one, she can run her tests and compare against herself, her own environment. I can run my own tests, compare against my own environment. But the problem is there's a real lack of, that's not the goal of the spec. The goal of the spec is to up-level that, is to be able to say universally, this is, here's a characterization of the performance for any given deployment. As such, and as we look across 10, 11, 12, 20 different service meshes, they come with, there are different architectures per service mesh. So for example, on line 74, we start the service mesh config, and there's an Ingress Gateway on line 75. Linkerd, as just an example, is a service mesh that does not have an Ingress Gateway. And as such, okay, we need to define within the spec what fields are mandatory and what are nice to haves, or what are optional. It is one thing. The other thing is so I guess the point that I'm getting to is here's a great question, is should the spec call out an Ingress Gateway versus an Egress Gateway, or should we refine the spec to be a bit more generic and more third normal form, if you will, meaning there would be instead of having Ingress and Egress Gateway, you could normalize it a little bit and say that there's a gateway. And then you might say, what type of gateway is it? Well, it was inbound or it was outbound. It was ingress or egress. Okay. But if you look on line 97, it's there's a sidecar. Okay. Well, what's the sidecar? Well, it's if we choose, it's for most of the service meshes, if they have an ingress gateway, an egress gateway, and a sidecar, the proxy that's inside is the same kind of proxy, which is to, okay. And so in this case, between lines 75 and 105, those are the same things. We're just repeating ourselves 3 times over. It's easier to read, if you're sitting there looking at the spec, but it's a bit repetitive, right? And so, okay, should we make that generic such that there's such a thing as a proxy, and we're capturing certain metrics about it. And then there's such an attribute as like its purpose or its type or its category or, and so so when you look at that, when you look at the metrics that are collected for a proxy, it's like, well, how many of them are there? Or, you know, how many of the thing are there? How many millicores is it using? How much CPU memory? How much traffic is it sending, receiving? That would seem like those are pretty generic. Those would be applicable to nodes in the cluster, applicable to proxies, applicable to application containers as well. And so, okay, so geez, how far do we make this generic versus overly explicit? I think this is the fork in the road. Like, I think this is the, yeah. So that's that's something to really consider. It's something that could be refined over time, could be changed over time. Every specification goes through revisions and versions. It could be that we're being quite repetitive, in which we are currently, and that maybe there's a later point in time in which we choose to be much more generic. The nice thing about a spec like this is that it's easier for people to read straight up like this. Like, the part of the trouble with the spec in this way is that it's fragile. So if a service mesh comes through and it adds, it's a good example. I don't know. Let me invert let me give this example instead and see where we have protocol on line 20. We've done a good job of having an enum here saying, well, these are the protocols that are of focus today. What about tomorrow? What about NATs? What about there's tens of hundreds of protocols, and this is good because this enum makes the spec less fragile. It sets it up for an additional protocol to be added. That's not quite the case where we're saying Ingress Gateway, Egress Gateway. If someone, if there's another type of gateway that comes through, that augments the spec quite a bit. So if someone wants to capture the fact that they have a load balancer in front of their cluster, so then is that an ingress of the ingress, or like where's that captured? So this, I guess in part that's what I'm getting. What I'm trying to tease out here is, yeah, a reflection on how generic to be. There's a lot of value that people derive from specific things. When you're specifically saying the spec talks about Kubernetes explicitly, has nodes and things. When it talks about ingress gateways and egress gateways, it's really specific and it's very helpful in context of just service mesh. But that it also becomes exclusionary and maybe myopic, maybe less. It's funny because it's really useful to those on a specific focus, maybe less useful to those that don't fit the mold. Okay. So as each of you sort of digest more of the spec, I think you'll come across other examples. So right here is probably a good example. So what on line 19, so 18 is this stanza, if you will, that talks about, it's a message that talks about the configuration of the load that you're going to generate, like the configuration of your environment and how you're going to run your test. So here it's like, okay, what protocol you're going to deal with traffic, you're going to generate traffic, you're going to analyze that traffic, look at those requests, what type of requests are they? Ultimately the spec is set up to really analyze a single type of traffic at a time. So is this TCP that we're looking at, or is it, so it's not intermixed per se. And that's, I would purport that that's pretty natural, but you might have an environment where you're studying both TCP and UDP, but probably those are two independent streams. And so are you trying to articulate characterize the performance of them in the same what's the right word? In the same report, like in the same, or two separate ones? The other thing about, like, if you look at line 36, okay, for a given test, here is the endpoint that's going to have load generated against it. Here's the target endpoint. It's like, well, in this case, we've done well to have that as a repeated string to acknowledge that it's not just necessarily a single endpoint under test, but it could be many. And great. Now, I think something we're probably missing out on here is like, well, wouldn't that quite commonly refer to your application, like the application, the workload under test? It's like maybe instead of going directly after the endpoint, that should be going after the name of the application. And then we go over to the application message and we look at some of its details. One of its details is one or more of its endpoints. So anyway, this is what I'm trying to help tease out and sort of figure out, is like how far do we take this back? How normalized do we make it? And my sense of it is that it is, please argue or discuss, but is that for the most part we shouldn't. Like for the most part, I think we should employ what I consider to be bad engineering practices or poor engineering practices, which is to say, I think that we should be, we should continue on the same vein that we have been, which is sort of fragile thinking. Yeah, the justification for that is that it's part of the value that people derive from this project is an opinion and is ultimately a standard to be measured against, and it is a forced function. Like as we go to define standard benchmarks and we conclude that one of the standard benchmarks is to have a multi-threaded database intense application under soak test for 4 hours at this rate, or like whatever that's just some random example of a standard benchmark. That's a very opinionated perspective about hopefully what is a representative workload, a representative workload common to what people are running out there. And then that's where people find value when you're explicitly saying when it's a bit more specific. So, okay, so Suhani is thinking about, has just kind of started to think about this a little bit. So Suhani, I won't put you on the spot and force you to but there was an issue that was raised. I think it was, if I recall, Suhani, it was to capture, was it node CPU?
Okay, so I didn't looked at in detail, but it was regarding some CPU like architecture or
Yeah.
something like that. Before that, I need to set up SMP, and then I will start working on this. So yeah,
Makes sense. Yeah, no, there it is. So 226. Good. So CPU architecture type, nice. Sort of differentiate or like, capture the number of sockets and then identify. So you can see like this stuff starts to go, can go fairly deep. So so Suhani, as you think on this particular issue is really ends up being so much less, so much less about any code as much as it's just about augmenting the proto here with fields that capture just that. Like right now, for the most part, I'm pretty sure that we're capturing like the number of CPU millicores. And that's good. But again, it's kind of that fragile start. It's sort of like a lack of acknowledgement that there are other attributes to a CPU. It's like, well, so should we have part of what the consideration that you'll make and we'll help you is, should there be a message type called CPU? And then should that message have, the CPU message have things like millicores, sockets, architecture, hyper-threaded. And then from there, the Ingress Gateway, for example, instead of on line 78, instead of it saying at 76 and 78, like how many cores does it have and how many millicores? I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. It's just line 78. Line 78 is CPU millicores. It would be, instead of that, it would be more of a reference to the CPU message.
Hey, hi everyone.
Hi, Neha.
Sorry, I joined a little late.
No, yeah, this is great. No, we're just thinking aloud about protos and the things that we're capturing. So actually very relevant to part of your focus as well. I have a proto question, being only knee deep into protobuf design myself. Of the example that we just gave, where we're considering breaking out CPU millicores and having our own CPU message, is anyone familiar with like what that reference would be?
Is it number of that CPU codes, or it is just the random value?
Yeah, like, so if we ended up defining a message type called CPU, and then of the attributes that it has, if it has number of sockets, number of millicores, architecture type, like CPU architecture type, whether it's whether these are physical cores or hyper-threaded cores. If that's defined in its own message, I'm sure that there's an example in here about how we interrelate messages. So Devendu, if you scroll up, a good example is yeah, I guess that's an example right there, right? Except that's of the same message. I don't know, is anybody any better at protobuf design than me?
Actually, this is how we define. So if we want to define just the way we have done client, it's hierarchical. That is, it's available only in performance test.config. So it will be available to other files at .client. So protocol is a custom type. It must be defined somewhere as a message. So this is how basically create custom types in protobuf, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, that is exactly the answer. So yeah, we would have CPU, a CPU type, a message type. So once you define the message type, then you can refer to that type of thing. Okay. Yeah, well, okay. So let's play that out a little bit more and maybe help advance Suhani's thinking here as well. Is that so here on line 29, yeah, we have protocol equals 3. Are we saying that by default, the default protocol is UDP with that 3?
Actually, it's
Oh, it's just a sequence of, oh, okay.
yeah, it will use it to serialize the button.
Perfect. Okay, cool. Suhani, does any of that making sense so far?
I have to set up SMP, I guess. After that, it will make much more sense. Yeah, but it helps which you have like explaining from the starting. So yeah, it was helpful.
Cool. Okay. Anybody else have thoughts on the?
So Lee, I have one question here. I mean, are we discussing this for the improvements of this spec?
Yeah.
Okay. And do we have any, like I saw, like I was running that performance test and I could see some of the parameters which are used in this spec. So overall, all the SMP performance is built on this prototype, is it?
Yeah, like the implementation in Meshery, they should be one and the same. Like if there are differences, like we have any, like one of the two should change.
Okay.
Yeah. And we do import the SMP the SMP package into Meshery, I think in a couple of places. And so, I mean, it should be the case that Meshery is implementing to spec. That's kind of the motion.
Okay. Yeah, I will go more about this through the doc and all.
Nice, good. On that topic, Neha, I'll say this as well, that within one of the things that Meshery CTL and Meshery UI, and so just Meshery does, or the way that part of the way that it implements the spec is, its implementation is called a performance profile, or part of the implementation is called a performance profile. The part of the implementation called a performance profile is, well, initially when you first define your performance profile, when you basically first define a test that you want to run, your Navendu, if you scroll up a little bit, for the most part, I think you're kind of defining from line 18 down to 47 or whatever. Like those should look fairly familiar to all of us as.
Yeah, I just created one performance profile and it was showing me this parameters. That's what I asked you, like this part is familiar to me, not full file.
Yeah. And so not only should these fields be more or less what you're seeing in Meshery's UI, but also if you ever deal with, if you ever want to use Meshery CTL to run a performance test. So Rudraksh has done this a bunch. So Rudraksh, you might be more up to speed on Meshery's implementation and how well it's the Meshery CTL, hence the performance profile, the file that you can supply to Meshery CTL. So you don't have to, when you want to run a test, you don't have to have 20 something arguments on the command line. You can just give it a file, a configure, performance profile. Are we currently tracking any deltas between the spec here and what that file supports?
I think I have an answer for that. Like I think in the spec, we don't capture the service mesh in this. So the what Mesh3CTL also supports. I mean, also takes in the with service mesh to run the performance test on. So I don't know, like if we should capture it in the spec as well. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's probably, it absolutely has to be here in the spec. And like, okay, if you do this for me, if you would, if you go back to the other protos, the one called service mesh, and it's, it's its own proto that just defines an enum full of service meshes by name. So this type, service mesh, we should find a reference to it in here. And so if you do a quick string search for service mesh, all one word, okay. All right. There we go. Okay, mesh type. And that is that's under the service mesh config. Okay. So there should be, yeah, I mean, yes is the answer to what you're asking, I think. Like there should be reference to it. So, Rudraksh, Navendu, do you guys remember reference being supported inside of Mesh3CTL's performance profile? Or Piyush?
No, I don't think so that it does right now. I mean, if you run it using UI, you'll find that service mesh field, but when you specify a test using a performance profile, and I'm just talking about right now, I'm not sure if Piyush's PR that is up right now captures this.
Okay, so I'll speak. SMP, the structure doesn't have any mesh, service mesh field. Okay, so what I do right now is capture mesh from the flag -- mesh and pass it to the Mesh3 server, and then it will process in the backend with that mesh type. I mean, service mesh.
And that can be okay. Like the implementation can still adhere to the spec, so long as that dash mesh or that other flag where we capture the type of service mesh, if those names are coming from so long as we're still referencing the spec, then it's an implementation of the spec. Like the implementation doesn't have to, just because something is all defined in one proto doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be all defined in the other, a direct reflection. Now, I do think that I would submit to you all that if, I'll use an example, I'll just say, Piyush is running a performance test, in a particular environment, and he would like for Rudraksh to go ahead and verify that he's seeing the same results, under the same profile, right? Like, so Piyush would probably just, hey, send over that file. Here's my performance profile. Can you try this out and verify that you're seeing the same things? And from an implementation perspective, it's probably really convenient, or it's more convenient if in that file that you're able to describe the fact that, yes, this is a console service mesh. And so, yeah, from a Mesh3's perspective, I would suggest to all of us that file support the service mesh type, which is also nice because just from a user's perspective, if you think about someone running a performance test from the command line, by the way, Navendu, do you have your command line just to be able to look at it? Is that someone would be able to just run Mesh3CTL perf apply. Anybody think that that's accurate? Or I'll share my terminal. So what do you think's more friendly to the user? Like just this, or if they also have to specify mesh type, and you know.
Not type, just only dash dash mesh. That's it.
Anybody have an opinion?
I think we should define everything in the profile, and we can maybe have flags to override it.
Nice, perfect. I remember having that conversation actually. Yes, I totally agree. But Piyush, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that actually makes like totally sense. But we need to like enhance that struct that I use to like kind of unmarshal the file to have that SMP service mesh field.
Just to clear, since we are referencing the service mesh, the mesh type field here, like I think Lee, you mentioned that we should just use this to capture the mesh type instead of having to change the proto here. I mean proto here. Is that what you mentioned?
Yep. That in this case, like I don't consider that the proto needs, that the spec needs to change for a given performance test result. For a given I'm missing the right word, like, but because I don't want to use Meshri's words, but like for a given performance profile, you have to be able to say what type of service mesh it is, and the spec captures that, and that's great. It doesn't capture that in the client config, which is fine. It captures it in the service mesh config, so that's great. Meshri just needs to use line 157, use that field.
Piyush, does that make sense?
Yeah, I'll look into it. I'm not so sure how I will use it, but I'll raise any queries if I have any in Slack, I mean.
Navendu, did you capture, previously we've talked about this particular behavior on Meshri CTL, where the argument would override what's in the file? Is that, do we already have an issue on that?
I think like Piyush's PR is
In line with that?
is going to, yeah.
One question that I have right now is this service mesh field is an integer type? I'm not sure it is written as equal to 18.
Oh, that's
Okay, we
just
have
how
numbers here.
protos are, yeah, protos are defined.
Okay, sure, cool, thanks.
I have one question, Navendu here, like this mesh control plane, that structure, where do we see these values in the UI? I did not got that. I mean, is it used internally when we trigger the performance test, depending on the Meshri server we select, like each adapter, I mean?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. It's both, actually. Does anybody have Meshri up by chance?
I have it.
But I was going to visually show you, but it's both. That when you just go over to performance management area and you initiate a new test, a new performance profile, there's a drop down that lists out the names of different service meshes, and that is sourced from the spec. If you find differences, then that's an issue. Like it needs to source from
Okay.
the spec.
Let me just open my Meshry. I have started it.
So you were
Should I share my screen?
Yep, sure. The vast majority, like all of the people on this call are Meshry contributors, or like, and so I think it's okay that we're talking about Meshry this much.
Yeah, so here if we see like profiles, manage profile. Just a minute, it's hanging here. Yeah, so suppose I add a new performance profile. It is hang little here.
Yeah, is it? Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah. Let me just refresh it.
Hopefully it's still up.
Yeah, add performance profile. So here you mean like
Correct. Correct.
if I select Istio, but this is the mesh type, right? Maybe.
Correct.
And like and so where are that mesh other which we saw in the spec? That properties we don't have here, right? I mean, we saw that profile spec, it is all same here, but we saw that mesh spec as well, right?
Right. So in the mesh spec, it for the most part, it just had an enum full of all capital letters of service mesh names. Like it was just trying to define once and for all, like this is how you refer to console as an example. And the same drop, if you do the drop down list one more time, it should be the case that each of these that this list matches like verbatim the other list in the service mesh proto.
Yes, we saw that list, so it matches this one, the names.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
fine. Yeah.
But then there's another area, there's a couple of other areas in Meshry where when the user initiates a test like that, like you just did, that if they're initiating a test from the Istio interface, as an example, like they're managing just that type of mesh, well, then they shouldn't have to choose, they shouldn't have to specify that it's that service mesh in their test. That should be auto-populated. The same.
Okay. So you mean this one, like line, Navendu, can you scroll up a little from line mesh control plane, mesh policy? No, scroll down only. Yeah, here, line 124, mesh or mesh port, this.
Yeah, so a lot of this info isn't, or most of that info is not being captured in Meshry's user interface. This is the type of important information that does need to be captured from Prometheus or from Grafana, and that as part of your ongoing focus, like that, yep, this is part of that validation. Is like, okay, so of the things that Meshery collects behind the scenes, the telemetry that it collects in the static boards, what's the delta between what's being identified as to be collected and what's actually being collected? Like what are we not? So one, that's part of the question. And there will be a delta, like that we're not collecting all of this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. This is the spec for static board, or it is the generic, I think, right, spec, what I understood for all the.
Wait, so say it again. This is the spec for the what?
This is the spec for the general performance test, right? It is not defined for static boards. I mean, that font I did not got.
Oh yeah, right. So Navendu, if you don't mind, if you go back up a bit to the section called performance test results, so in line 49, once Meshery has run a test and it produces, it does some statistical analysis and produces results, it should implement, everything that's under the performance test result from 49 to 72 should be in that result. Like Meshery should give you that.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. And but then also there are other, so basically, like we in some respects we're trying to verify that Meshery has fully implemented the spec. And so if we so as we look at like the Prometheus node exporter, Navendu, if you scroll,
so maybe we can I'll scroll down this.
So if we don't have anything captured about, if you keep going, is the word node in here? It should be under environment config. So this is sort of where the static, like the relationship between static boards in Meshery and what we're trying to capture in the spec is. So in the environment that you run the test within, how many nodes did it have? How much resources did they have? Is the node message. The other message about individual workload is like, okay, well, what application were you testing and how many resources was it given? That's what's being articulated here. And it's under like the spec needs to evolve, so what Kubernetes version were you running in that environment? Like that's what, how many nodes were there on line 177? Like how many instances of that workload did you have of assuming that the workload was like the same kind. And this is where like, it starts to get kind of fragile. It's like, well, the workload that I was testing, it had Redis, and then it had this Golang server, and then it had this other thing. And so they're not all uniform. It's not like I can just say the workload count is 5. Because it's like, well, no, there were 5 different kinds of workloads. So,
Okay.
I think like of the example that I just gave, I think the spec actually does capture that. So it's like, as long as you can capture the fact that you have 5 different workloads and they might have had different resources assigned, that might have been enough.
Okay.
Cool. So on that topic, just briefly, Utkarsh, I was talking to the vendor yesterday, and I had said that, hey, this is the 58th time that I will be speaking to someone about filling in the auto-populating the endpoints field in the performance profile test. And so, not with respect to Neha's conversation, I just mean like user experience. And so just a note for Utkarsh. Cool. So that'd be 59. Okay. Good. Anybody else? I mean, I guess so. Yeah, Neha, it's like I had. Do you Are you confident? Do you have a list of what's being collected in the static boards in Meshery?
Actually, I just not really. I have captured the data yet. But first question I have is like, what do you say when you say static board? Like in the Grafana, whatever boards we see, it is dynamic or static. That also I don't aware about.
Right. Yeah. Did Dhruv? Dhruv is the person to answer that for you. Should have a link. If it doesn't, then.
I mean the boards which I see in the Meshery server. When I just yesterday we were not able to see all those boards. So that I.
So let me send you a link to a doc. Static boards are not shown in the UI. It's a made up term. As you digest that spec, please do publicly ask Dhruv questions around it if you do.
Okay. Okay, let me check. Go through this. Yeah, this is static templates. Okay.
There's a mesh sync nodes metric collection. There's another spec that's linked from this one. It's the one that Navendu is sharing.
Yeah. Yes, I got that.
Okay.
Mesh sync node metrics collection. Okay. So I don't see this board. I mean, I have not seen this boards, static boards yet.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think that we need to empower you to be able to see those. Yeah. Let me follow up to make sure that you've got the right tooling. Like those static boards are just collected by Meshery. They're not shown back in the UI. And I don't think that they're made available as you retrieve. If you go back in time and look up your performance test, I don't think that those are shown either. They used to be. And
they are not shown.
Okay.
Like, yeah, they are not shown.
Okay. Okay, they were in the past, and so we have a regression issue here. We need to make sure that they do get shown. Yeah. Yep. So actually, this is a helpful conversation just because it was an oversight that. Neha, do you mind not or raising an issue that's saying, static board data is inaccessible?
Okay, yeah, I will raise.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Navendu, what other topics do we have today?
We are going to talk about the benchmark test, and Sungu had raised a couple of questions. So maybe we can help him clarify some of these. So he was asking about the kind of test cases that were needed for us to define, and these couple of questions and about the environment we'll be running these tests on in the CNCF testbed. So yeah.
Okay. All right. Good. Yeah, those are. Let's skip to Rudraksh's. In some respects, like Sunku needs to. Wish he were on the call. He needs to step forward and define those answers, like answer those questions himself. Let's jump to Rudraksh's item, because this is something that we want to let everyone know about and send out the details of, because this will actually help answer some of Sunku's questions because we will tell him we're testing in an environment now, and here's what that environment looks like. It's a Ubuntu VM running in a GitHub runner, and then Rudraksh, I thought that the PR that you tossed up was very well articulated, and that you identified the behavior of it.
Yeah, so I'll quickly share my screen and elaborate on some things about what actually happens. I mean, what is the architecture of the machine when you use GitHub Actions? So basically, when we use the GitHub runner, like which is freely available and we can exploit it, it is actually an Azure VM, and mostly it is a DSV2. So we have some of the data on it here. I'll quickly paste the link in chat. So that covers it up. Like GitHub Actions offer a few of the environments to test this. I'm assuming that you will most probably use Ubuntu and the latest one because it works. And Mac OS and Windows, probably not so good environments for testing. And yeah, regardless of the OS that you're using, if you're using the GitHub hosted runner, it would allocate you one of these Azure VMs, and it's pretty random. Like, I'm yet not sure on what exactly would be the number of CPUs and the RAM that would be allocated to you. So that might affect the test configuration. And as we were discussing during the duration of call, that to maintain a consistency, we need to have consistent setups for running performance tests, right? So yes.
Or to the extent that that's out of our control, and that like, so long as the, yes is the answer. Like, yes, you're right. Like, but also the fact that the environment has changed doesn't necessarily invalidate the test. It just means, shoot, we got to run more tests so that we have enough tests using one environment, all of the environments.
Oh, okay.
So long as we know what the environment was for that test, then we're okay.
Good.
With that, it's where
Okay,
somebody
cool. Yeah, okay. I thought it was kind of like, yeah. So,
no, I mean, like, you're right that there are certain tests where, like, hey, if you're trying to get to an answer and you're like, okay, so we want to analyze this thing and we want to run these series of tests. And if your environment is changing on you every time, it can make it really tough you'd have to, like, if you don't have control over it, yeah, you're going to have to just run 500 tests until you get enough, times where you got the same environment to do your thing. But so long as you know what the environment is, at least you're not being misled. You know what I mean?
yeah, so I guess for that, we might need to ask people to bring their own, self-hosted GitHub Action runners to get the best and efficient result.
So Rudraksh, like, here's a good question for us. It's like directly an answer to Sunku's questions. Is like, well, if we can, when we go to use the CNCF's labs and we go to use their hardware, if we can bring their hardware as a self-hosted runner, great. Like, we can continue to use GitHub to schedule the tests and run the thing, and we can leverage all of the work that you've done and just use those runners.
Yep, sounds good. I guess we can, and we should.
Yeah. But the self-hosted runners are free to use with GitHub Actions, but you're responsible for the cost of maintaining your runner machines. Okay, good. So the CNCF will pay for it. That's fine. That's great. I mean, and so what we should do, folks, is write up the meeting minutes, tell people that the intended thing here is to go set in action what Rudraksh has written and let it run wild on some free GitHub hosted runners. Look and confirm that those in fact are, that we're getting the right info, that these work, et cetera. And then we'll go ask the CNCF for time on their systems. Use the self-hosted runners to do the same thing. And yeah, this is really great. I mean, really, like, this is actually really exciting. It's been like a year and a half of having the question out in front of us, what's the comparative overhead across these service meshes? And it's been like way too big of a challenge to go write bespoke tooling to do it. If we've got it all wrapped up into a single GitHub action. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Now, part of what Neha is looking at with static boards and what's being collected is is important here, because if we're not collecting the right things in those static boards, we won't have a record of, or won't be collected. We won't know what those self-hosted runners have, or the GitHub hosted runners have. So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, okay, I'll write down some of the stuff. So, what can we do? I mean, to ensure we have consistent stuff. So that covers this one. And so, yeah, that's one of the topics that I have. So do I skip to the other one? Like,
Yeah,
I guess this. Okay. So basically, I set up a couple of E2E tests for Mishri using the SMP action that we have. And I don't have the tab open. Yikes. So basically, you can trigger them manually, or there's a cron schedule set up for them, which triggers at this weird time, like in every 12 hours. I mean, 43rd minute of every 12 hours. It's an arbitrary time, because sometimes GitHub drops the scheduled jobs due to a lot of incoming traffic. And yes, that's a problem with GitHub runners and GitHub actions. For this, we are using this. And even if we do scheduled tests, we might face that token thing, because I tried several times. I don't know, for some reason the token doesn't get refreshed when running in the GitHub action. Might be cookies or stuff. So that's a challenge to running scheduled test. Other than that, you can very easily run this manually. You'll just need a fresh provide token just to make sure that it works. And if you just go here, I mean, select your workflow and paste that provided token here.
So,
yeah, and it would spin up tests for Mishri in cluster, Mishri out of cluster, and multiple Kate's versions. The latest releases, like the latest minor releases of all the major versions. And yeah, basically that's all what it's doing. Since the action uses Mishri CTL and Mishri extensively for doing performance tests, we also capture these tests using this single workflow itself. That's it.
awesome. Yeah. Yeah. I think you've got, yeah. So we're at time. I think there's a couple of people that probably have some questions about like the ability to define what workload is deployed, what app sample app is deployed. And
Okay.
if there's a certification for GitHub Action developer, I suggest that you sit for that exam. I'll pay for it if you do. If there is, like, seriously gonna do that. All right. Anybody have anything else for today?
Lee, even I missed that part. I was opening the ticket. So the static boards you said is not in the UI. So I mean, what should I like mention? Like,
Yeah, users are unable to see metrics about their environment. So users cannot recall and view, statistics about the nodes, and so.
okay.
Thank you, Navendu.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and Yvonne, not that I've spent any time in WSL2, but I consider this kind of magical what's happening there, and I think it is a Ubuntu centered environment. So it's probably your ticket to ride.
I think Anirban is speaking, but we can't hear you.
That's how I like it.
Anirban, maybe we can catch up on Slack.
Thank you all. Catch you all later.
Hey guys.